Texas. Summer heat rising off the flat plains. Barbed wire shimmering under a punishing sun. A young German woman steps off the back of a military truck, dust clinging to her boots, hands trembling around a small canvas satchel. It is 1944. The war she knew is an ocean away. Here, the air smells of cattle fields instead of smoke and ruins. But nothing feels safe. Her uniform is gone, replaced by plain work clothes issued hours earlier. A white armband marks her as a prisoner of war. Around her, hundreds of others stand silent, disoriented, unsure whether to fear the guards or the distant whistles of American farmers staring from beyond the camp fence. She was told Americans were brutal. She was told captivity meant pain. Every rumor from home warned of humiliation worse than death. An officer points her toward a low wooden building, medical processing painted in black letters. Inside, she will face the first shock of this new world. The rules of war, the rules of decency, the rules she never imagined her captors might follow. She hesitates at the doorway, not knowing that what happens next will reshape everything she believes about her enemy and about herself. By 1944, the war in Europe had turned decisively against the Third Reich. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June, the collapse of German lines in France, and relentless Soviet advances from the east meant thousands of German soldiers were surrendering every week. The United States, already hosting large numbers of Italian and German prisoners, began receiving even more, not just frontline troops, but support personnel, naval auxiliaries, and, in rare cases, women. Transport across the Atlantic was a quiet but immense logistical operation. Prisoners boarded former troop ships or converted cargo vessels under armed escort. The propaganda many had heard warned them that Americans tortured captives or left them to starve. Some had seen Nazi posters depicting the U.S. as a land of racialized violence and chaos. Fear followed them onto every ship. But what greeted them was different. The United States was not a war-torn battlefield. It was a secure homeland with intact infrastructure, abundant farmland, and industrial might. And it adhered to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required prisoners be given food, medical care, clothing, and shelter equivalent to what U.S. soldiers received. Texas became one of the largest centers of POW confinement in America. Wide-open land, railway access, and available barracks made the state an ideal choice. Camps like Hereford, Camp Bowie in Brownwood, Camp Swift, Camp Puig, Huntsville, and dozens of branch camps spread across the plains. They were often surrounded by farmland desperate for labor, millions of acres needing hands while American men fought overseas. German prisoners arriving in Texas encountered a paradox. The heat was harsh. The landscape was unfamiliar and intimidating. The barbed wire symbolized total defeat. Yet many noticed something unexpected. Guards who addressed them calmly, Red Cross inspections ensuring standards of treatment, and food, sometimes more than they'd received in the collapsing Reich. Still, the fear did not vanish. Every new arrival faced medical processing, vaccinations, health checks, and sanitation routines designed to prevent outbreaks. For many German women, these procedures were a moment of deep uncertainty. Exposed, examined, and stripped of the identity that uniform once gave them, they stepped into a world where their enemy offered care instead of vengeance. But kindness could be confusing, and for some, it was even more terrifying than hatred. Because the question lingered, why would an enemy treat prisoners like human beings, even when their own country had taught them enemies had none? Most of the German prisoners shipped to America were men. Infantry, U-boat crews, Luftwaffe personnel. But Germany's total war mobilization meant women served increasingly in signals units, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, clerical corps, and field support roles. When captured near ports, airfields, or rear command posts, small groups of these women found themselves processed through the same global POW network. They were a minority, but their presence in U.S. captivity was real, and it challenged expectations on both sides of the wire. At Texas camps, daily life followed routines built on clear rules. The U.S. Army Service Forces ran the system with an eye on compliance and order. Camp commanders maintained records down to the calorie, rations equal to those of American troops, medical logs for every vaccination, disciplinary reports, and work schedules approved under Geneva protections. Work became central. The war had stripped rural Texas of labor. Cotton fields, grain, and cattle operations were desperate for workers. German POWs filled the gap. They were paid small wages in canteen coupons, enabling them to buy cigarettes, toiletries, or stationery. Some sent letters home describing a strange truth. Their enemy was feeding them well. For the women, labor assignments were more limited, mostly clerical tasks within camps, laundry, food prep, gardening, or Red Cross-supervised relief duties. Yet even those restricted roles placed them regularly in proximity to Americans, military and civilian alike. And that proximity sparked friction and curiosity. Many Texans had expected monsters, a generation raised on headlines about Nazi brutality. Instead, they saw young people not much different from themselves, anxious, embarrassed, and far from home. Some locals, especially farmers who hired work detachments, treated the prisoners with cautious respect. Others watched from a distance, gripped by suspicion. Stories circulated in nearby towns, some hostile, others sympathetic. A few newspapers questioned whether prisoners were being treated too well, eating meat while ration stamps tightened for citizens. Rumors claimed the POWs laughed at their captors, or that women among them might seduce local men. Fear clashed with empathy, and gossip filled the gaps between policy and perception. Inside the camps, dignity was fragile. Uniforms replaced with work clothing, armbands marking captivity, medical checks requiring exposure before strangers. Any misstep became a reminder. You are a defeated enemy, surviving at the mercy of those your government once dehumanized. Yet many American guards treated the rules of war seriously, not out of kindness, but purpose. The U.S. needed leverage. If they upheld Geneva standards, perhaps Axis nations might treat captured Americans the same. For the women prisoners, this created a complex emotional battlefield. Gratitude for humane treatment, shame at being dependent on an enemy, anxiety that kindness might hide a deeper humiliation, and soon, that anxiety would collide with a moment of startling vulnerability, one that would challenge everything they expected about captivity and about themselves. For the German women held in Texas, captivity was defined by uneasy contradictions. They arrived exhausted from long voyages, bodies still stiff from weeks below deck, sleep fractured by fear. Their first nights in camp were filled with unfamiliar noises, cicadas in the heat, the distant howl of coyotes, replacing the air raid sirens they'd known at home. Some women wrote secretly in diaries, describing the humiliation of surrender. Others remembered hunger finally easing when they received their first full American meal. A few kept silent, still convinced brutality was coming, that kindness was merely a staged deception. Yet small, human moments softened the wire. A guard tipping his cap in respect. A nurse offering water during medical inspection. Sunlight filtering through a wooden barrack window. These moments brought guilt as much as comfort, because feeling safe in the enemy's hands was, in itself, a painful wound. The U.S. Army ran POW housing like a carefully engineered system. Camps were arranged into compounds, rows of barracks, mess halls, recreation yards, latrine blocks, infirmaries. Guard towers stood at the corners, visible reminders that mercy existed inside boundaries. Transportation was precise. Prisoners were catalogued, tagged, and distributed to camps based on security risk and labor potential. Clothes were disinfected, personal items logged, camp medics screened for lice, disease, and injuries. Nothing was left to circumstance. Disease could spread faster than barbed wire could contain. For the women, tactical routines felt invasive. Roll calls at dawn, movement regulated through gates, work details assigned with military efficiency. Every step measured, every belonging inspected. The enemy had defeated them, and now controlled every aspect of their day, down to when they could wash their hair or write a letter home. Medical care, meant to protect prisoners, became one of the most emotionally charged experiences. Under Geneva rules, the U.S. had to maintain prisoners' health. That meant delousing baths, vaccinations, and thorough physical checks upon arrival. Most women had never been examined by male personnel before. Many had no warning of what was to come. Clothing was removed. Bodies inspected for lice, wounds, and malnutrition. Hair checked in harsh fluorescent light. Uniforms replaced by simple work garments. The shock was not physical pain. It was vulnerability. It was the realization that rank and nationality no longer shielded dignity. Later, some would admit the procedures were professional and respectful. Others would never forget the burning humiliation of the moment, a wound that lingered long after captivity. Because even when the enemy shows care, being powerless still hurts. The U.S. Army Service Forces oversaw every POW camp with procedural discipline. Commanders balanced humane treatment with strict security. Feed them well, treat them medically, but never forget they served Hitler's war machine. Red Cross teams made scheduled and surprise visits, inspecting kitchens, punishment logs, and barrack conditions. Their reports shaped international opinion. One violation could risk retaliation against Americans held in Europe. Female prisoners added complications. Policies required protection from abuse by guards and by male prisoners. Housing had to be separated. Medical staff had to ensure privacy, though resources were often limited. Some camps specifically trained personnel to handle female POW needs. Others improvised under pressure. Every administrative decision, a ration list, a work assignment, a disciplinary note, carried the weight of global war. Americans weren't simply running a prison. They were demonstrating to the world that even enemies deserved rules. German women arrived in the U.S. carrying fear crafted by propaganda. Nazi broadcasts had painted America as a land of predatory soldiers and racial violence. They imagined captivity filled with beatings, starvation, or worse. The contrast with reality, orderly camps, medical care, edible food, was disorienting. But propaganda didn't flow only one direction. American media sometimes exaggerated German atrocities, sparking public resentment that POWs were living comfortably in small-town Texas. Some newspapers criticized camp privileges like orchestras, sports fields, and libraries. A few headlines warned local women to stay away, feeding rumors that female prisoners might tempt American men or steal attention from servicemen overseas. Fear on both sides created a psychological no-man's land. Neither truly knew the other, only the version drawn by wartime politics. Texas was a land shaped by tradition, church communities, cowboy labor, and wartime sacrifice. German women behind the wire challenged those norms. Some civilians were curious and empathetic, astonished to discover their enemy looked more like a neighbor's daughter than a monster from propaganda posters. Others were uneasy. With husbands and sons fighting overseas, local women viewed female POWs with distrust. fearing competition, corruption, or moral danger. The mere existence of young, foreign women working fields or seen near American guards stirred anxieties. Churches whispered warnings. Schools discouraged curiosity. Some civilians refused to acknowledge the camps at all, hoping the war's ugliness stayed behind the fences. For the prisoners, these social dynamics were a battlefield they could not navigate. Every glance from a civilian could carry judgment or unexpected kindness. And soon, a single moment inside the camp would force all these conflicting emotions, fear, shame, duty, and humanity, to collide. Camp Bowie, Brownwood, Texas. Late August 1944. A convoy arrives under the glare of a midday sun. Among the prisoners are 24 German women, captured weeks earlier with anti-aircraft units near Cherbourg. Their ranks show the stress of defeat. Shoulders tight, lips cracked from long transport, eyes fixed forward. They expect cruelty. Instead, the first order issued to them is calm. Proceed to medical inspection. They enter a barracks-like processing building. Inside stands a line of U.S. Army Medical Corps staff and nurses from the Women's Army Corps. The women POWs are told to remove their clothing for delousing, a standard health procedure for all arrivals, male and female, but to them, it feels like exposure before the enemy. Shoes collected, dresses folded, dog tags placed in small envelopes. Then, the most jarring moment. A guard instructs them to sit. The benches are treated with chemical disinfectants to kill lice, a routine used on thousands of POWs. But the women, unaware of the substance's purpose, hesitate. The wooden planks are cold and slick. Some think the chemicals could burn. Others believe this is punishment, the humiliation propaganda warned them about. One woman, later identified in Red Cross notes as Anna S., age 22, whispers, "Es tut weh, wenn ich sitze." It hurts when I sit. A medic overhears. He tries to explain, slowly, gently, that the sting means the delousing agent is working. But fear has already taken hold. Several women begin to cry. A few refuse to sit at all, clutching their arms over their chests, trembling. To the Americans, it is routine sanitation. To the prisoners, it is a moment of utter powerlessness. When they move to the showers, more confusion erupts. Water pressure is strong. The room echoes with commands meant to maintain order. Nurses attempt to reassure them, but language barriers turn instructions into shouts. Wet, shivering, silent. The women feel shame closing in. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected occurs. A WAC nurse brings towels and places them gently around each woman's shoulders. Another hands out sanitary products, explaining through gestures how to use them. A doctor orders the male guards to step outside, leaving female personnel to continue. Small gestures. But for women who believed they were entering a world of torment, these gestures become the first cracks in a wall of fear built over years of propaganda. By the time they emerge in clean clothing, plain but fresh, the shock remains. The humiliation is real, but so is the kindness, and this contradiction will become the turning point, not only in how these women view captivity, but how they understand their enemy's humanity. For the rest of that day, the confusion lingered like a fresh bruise. The women filed into their assigned barracks, still processing the shock of exposure and chemical stinging. The humiliation of having been ordered to sit, a moment seared into memory, became a whispered refrain among them. But something else grew equally persistent: the absence of cruelty. Later that same week, a Red Cross inspection team arrived at Camp Bowie, a scheduled visit that ensured POW treatment met international law. Inspectors interviewed the newly arrived women, privately, documenting their fears, discomfort, and the startling reality that American personnel had tried to protect their dignity when procedures allowed. Their report noted a remarkable detail. The prisoners expressed fear of mistreatment based on propaganda, yet observed respectful conduct by camp staff. This clash, terror shaped by rumor versus reality shaped by rules, began shifting fear into confusion, and confusion into reluctant trust. Within days, the women received letters from the German Red Cross confirming their capture had been officially registered. That meant their families now knew they were alive, a gift beyond measure in wartime Europe. They began eating meals more willingly. Some ventured into the camp yard during recreation hours. One asked to join a choir the male POWs had formed. Psychological walls were not gone, but they were cracking. Meanwhile, American reaction was mixed. A report in a nearby newspaper mentioned female Nazi prisoners being housed at Camp Bowie. The story quickly became a topic in grocery lines and church benches. Some locals disapproved of any sympathy toward Hitler's soldiers, especially women. Rumors circulated that they had served as fanatical helpers of the Reich, too dangerous to be trusted. Yet others responded differently. Farm families receiving POW labor returned with stories that surprised their neighbors. They spoke of women who avoided eye contact out of shame, who thanked them in broken English, who worked hard without complaint. One farmer's wife reportedly said, "They look more scared of us than we are of them." Inside the camp, a subtle but profound shift took place. After the delousing incident, camp leadership revised their approach. WWII nurses were placed in charge of all future female intake. Written explanations in German were provided before procedures began. The humiliation of confusion was replaced with the dignity of understanding. No one pretended captivity was comfortable or equal. These women were still enemies, still behind wire, still stripped of power. Some would carry the trauma of those early hours for life. But the turning point had been reached. They had arrived expecting torture and found an enemy choosing restraint. They had braced for hatred and encountered rules instead. And slowly, painfully, they began to realize not every nation fights war by destroying its enemy's humanity. By late 1945, as the European War ended and the U.S. Army prepared to demobilize millions of troops, the existence of German POWs in Texas, including the handful of women quietly placed in administrative duties, shifted from a war necessity to a political burden. Repatriation now became the priority. Official guidance from the War Department mandated that all German POWs must be returned to Europe, regardless of rank, behavior, or desire to remain. But the process was neither quick nor simple. Many prisoners had spent years integrated into camp routines and Texas agriculture. They harvested cotton near Hereford, canned vegetables in Huntsville, repaired ranch fencing in the Panhandle, labor that kept local economies running while American men were overseas. As ships became available, these same workers were pulled abruptly from their jobs, replaced at times by school children or hastily hired civilians. Local newspapers documented rising anxieties about crops spoiling without German help. A quiet acknowledgement of how dependent rural communities had become on enemy labor. The female POWs, officially classified as auxiliary personnel, entered the repatriation pipeline with special restrictions. Medical screenings were conducted privately, their names omitted from press lists. A 1945 internal report from 8th Service Command described them only as non-combatant internees fulfilling clerical functions. Even in their departure, invisibility was the rule. Transport convoys carried them by rail to ports such as Newport News, Virginia. A 1946 quartermaster log records that 9,626 German prisoners left Texas between January and June. Some were transferred not to Germany, but to Britain and France first, where they were obligated to perform further labor to compensate for wartime destruction. For those who had hoped American kindness might grant them a new life, this redirection felt like exile upon exile. Prison chaplains and camp sponsors noted a surge of emotional farewells. Texas farmers, who had once viewed the Germans with suspicion, now shook their hands, wrote recommendations, even gifted them pocket Bibles and photographs. At Camp Bowie, a group of local women presented embroidered handkerchiefs to prisoners who had built furniture for a church nursery. It was a gesture small in scale, but monumental in implication. Enemies were leaving as neighbors. Not all were comfortable with this sentiment. Editorials argued that the Germans had been treated too well, receiving better food and health care than many Texans suffering rationing. The presence of female prisoners, still little known but rumored, intensified quiet controversy. Had the Army violated moral boundaries by housing young German women so near American soldiers? And yet, despite tensions, the POW system concluded smoothly. There were no mass riots, no catastrophic escapes, only a trail of buses, trains, and ships carrying thousands back to a homeland they barely recognized. The Texas camps emptied, leaving behind silence, photographs, and questions. For decades, the story of German POWs in America, especially the women briefly held in Texas, lived in the margins of history. Official documents acknowledged the existence of only a handful of female captives, categorized blandly as service auxiliaries, and their wartime experiences rarely appeared in memoirs or post-war scholarship. Silence was a defense mechanism. Returning to a shattered Germany, these women often faced accusations of betrayal simply for surviving captivity without abuse. Some concealed their POW status entirely, fearing that kindness experienced in America would be judged as collaboration. American communities, meanwhile, carried the memory very differently. In Hereford, Texas, the POW-built chapel, with its delicate frescoes of angels, German script, and a European landscape, became a quiet symbol of reconciliation. Local residents preserved it long after the prisoners were gone, a reminder that even in wartime, beauty can be built by hands labeled enemy. The structure was eventually designated a historical site, and pastors still tell visitors that German prisoners once painted hope on its walls. Some relationships forged behind barbed wire endured. Archival letters document former POWs writing back to Texan ranch families who had treated them with dignity. A few returned after the war to visit, and at least 2 marriages are recorded in county files involving former German internees and local residents. Their stories moved gradually from shame to pride, woven into family lore on both sides of the Atlantic. Institutionally, the Texas camps influenced how the U.S. military later approached enemy prisoners. Reports emphasized that humane treatment, good food, fair discipline, medical care, reduced resistance, improved productivity, and created goodwill that reshaped post-war diplomacy. The War Department specifically cited these lessons in designing Cold War-era detention policies. The presence of female prisoners sparked further internal guidance. Future camps should plan in advance for female captives' privacy, medical care and protection from harassment, a bureaucratic acknowledgement of an issue once quietly ignored. Yet the legacy is uneven. For many veterans who served as guards or administrators, the memory is bittersweet. Some admitted that encountering humanity in their enemy complicated their post-war understanding of the conflict. A former MP from Camp Swift wrote in 1978, "I went to war believing hate was required. Texas taught me otherwise." Today, remnants of those camps remain. Weathered foundations in cotton fields, interpretive plaques, local museum displays. They testify not to battles but to encounters. Awkward, cautious, then transformative. The women who passed through Texas left almost no monuments of their own, only footnotes and faded log entries. But the questions their presence raised, about dignity in captivity, about how nations treat defeated foes, about the fragile line between compassion and suspicion, continue to shape how we remember the war. Their story endures not because it was loud, but because it was human. Freedom carries many flags, but in the silence of captivity, dignity becomes the only true banner a human being can hold. These German women, once told that Americans were monsters, discovered instead a strange contradiction. That an enemy can treat you better than the nation you served. A guard who hands you clean clothes. A nurse who checks your temperature. A farmer's wife who offers fresh vegetables after her shift in the fields. Acts so small that propaganda could never prepare them for the shock of kindness. There was humiliation, yes, not the violent kind they feared, but the unfamiliar vulnerability of being cared for by those they were taught to hate. Shame and comfort became entangled. Barriers they once believed unbreakable dissolved not through violence, but through soap, food, and civility. War draws lines. Uniforms enforce them. Camps and fences strengthen them. But the fleeting interactions, conversations through a wire fence, a smile exchanged during roll call, a nurse gently pressing a bandage into place, those are where history reveals its deeper truth. That people remain people, even when governments insist they are enemies. When they finally sailed home across the Atlantic, many carried an unexpected burden. The knowledge that compassion can defy allegiance, and that mercy, once experienced, can forever change the way war is remembered. Not every prisoner walked away grateful, but none walked away unchanged.